Good afternoon. My name is Allison Kaplan. I'm Director of Education here at the National First Ladies Library in Canton, Ohio. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to let you know that this program will be streaming on Facebook Live as well as be recorded for our YouTube channel. So if you join us late today or you want to share the program with a friend or family member, please be sure to check out our social media channels for more information. Before we get started, I also want to let you know that we will be taking questions later in the program. So please feel free to add any questions that you may have for our speaker today regarding the film or regarding Michelle Obama to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen if you're joining us on Zoom. If you're joining us on Facebook today, you can put your questions in the chat and we will attempt to get to them as well. Before we get started, I also want to remind you of some of the upcoming programs related to National First Ladies Library. You might have seen some of them scrolling on the screen if you joined us a little bit early today. On January 25th, we're really excited to have our very first live cooking segment. So if you have noticed via Facebook or Instagram, we've been working with the Cooking with the First Ladies, Sarah, and she will be joining us live for a cooking segment, which we're really excited. So Sarah Morgan of Cooking with the First Ladies will be talking about Grace Coolidge and the Roaring 20s and be doing a live cooking demo. So we're really pumped about that. February 22nd, we have our book club, Mrs. Grant and Madam Jewel. We're really excited about that. It's a really fun discussion, and you can find out more information about the book or about the discussion on our Eventbrite or social media. And then our next film, and we're partnering with Stark Library for this film series. So if you didn't get a chance to, you can always hop on Eventbrite, register, or if you are an Ohio person or Stark local person, you can hop on Stark Library's website and screen a documentary through Hoopla about a pertinent woman who is doing something interesting and amazing, and then join us for a monthly discussion. So this month our topic is Michelle Obama, and next month we have She Makes Comics, and I'm really excited for that one. I think we're going to be joined by Sequoia Bostic, who is a illustrator and designer from Cleveland, who will be talking about her comics and how comic makers throughout history, female African-American women comics may have influenced, comic book artists may have influenced her. So I'm super excited about that. And without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker for today. Leah Wright Rigueur is an assistant professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She's a historian by training, and her research interests include 20th century United States political and social history and modern African-American history, and emphasize race, civil rights, political ideology, the American two-party system, and the presidency. At the Kennedy School, she teaches courses on race, riot and backlash in the United States, the civil rights movement, race and policy in modern America. She also leads Race and American Politics, a multidisciplinary series of seminars and roundtables co-sponsored by the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation and the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, and dedicated to the most pressing political and social issues related to race in the US. Her first book, The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics in the Pursuit of Power, was published by Princeton University Press in 2015. Her current book project is Mourning in America, Black Men in a White House, and it explores the intersection of race, class, and politics in the presidential administration of Ronald Reagan. And we are so excited to have Dr. Rigueur here today to discuss Michelle Obama. She was also featured in CNN's First Ladies documentary, which is really pertinent to our discussion today and how she got on our radar, but I'm really excited to check out her book. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're super excited to have you to discuss Michelle Obama.
Muted. Thank you so much for having me here today. And I'm really excited to discuss Michelle Obama and whatever questions that you guys may have that come up in relation to the subject. So thank you.
The first thing I wanted to touch on is Michelle Obama's upbringing. The documentary goes into how she grew up on the south side of Chicago. Her dad was a shift worker. Her mom was a stay-at-home mom for part of her upbringing. And they lived in a really small space for a short time above her aunt's apartment. And I was really interested in how you felt that her upbringing impacted her story and her biography.
Well, I think, this is her upbringing is one of the central parts of who Michelle Obama is. And I think it's central to the storytelling and the myth making around her as well. So it operates in two different ways. So in the first way, I think we can think about, what is it like to grow up a working class Black family on the south side of Chicago, and within this kind of environment. And so she talks about, the effects of seeing her father go to work, the effects of having a mother that stayed at home and kind of these, somewhat traditional roles, but also was extremely hardworking. We also know, the effect of having the closeness that she has with her brother and with her extended family, and this idea of, grandparents or such, or extended community. The idea it takes a village comes to mind. But I also think, just more broadly, in terms of how Michelle Obama begins to cement herself in the American kind of mythos around herself, right? So how we begin to perceive her is this idea that she is one with the people, that she is from the people, that she has working class roots, that she grows up in a small, not privileged environment, that not only is she, does she have to take on the idea of class alone, essentially alone, or this is part of her upbringing, but also has to take on the idea of race. So this idea of race and class is central to her identity, but it is central to how we understand her as well.
Can you talk in this documentary, as well as Becoming Michelle's book and the documentary, there's the discussion of the perfection complex that Black women face. And Michelle brings up two stories in the book. One, as a child, as a kindergartner, having that experience of being tested, making a mistake, and wanting to go back and fix it, and the next day begging to be retested. And the other was getting into college and being told, you're not Princeton material. I wanted you to kind of elaborate on that perfection complex that Black women and Michelle Obama face.
So certainly, I think there is this idea that when you are Black, and particularly when you're a Black woman, that you don't get second chances. And so we know that it's backed up with all kinds of data and anecdote as well that says, for testing, instead of being seen as, oh, perhaps you didn't get a chance to study, or perhaps you didn't have, the tools or the resources, that instead it's a reflection of your identity. So it's kind of what we call, the essentializing feature, meaning that people can't break out of the barriers of what testing or what their environment says that they have to be. Now we know that for the majority of Americans, particularly white Americans, that's simply not the case, that they get the privilege of having opportunity, even if that opportunity doesn't always work out. So we see that a lot of times the perfection, complex comes out of this moment where it's like, we can't mess up. We don't have second chances. So it's not simply a test, it's a test that determines your future. And I think one of the things that's really powerful is that how it, when she tells that story about being in kindergarten or being at a young age and taking this test, that by then, even at that young age, this idea of the perfection complex had already seeped in. But then too, there's this idea that, and I think this is one that's much more broadly expressed. It's not expressed in her home, but she's already internalized it from outside forces, that she's simply not material for Princeton, that people like her don't go to Princeton, right? And in some ways, it's really interesting because she tells these stories about how, in fact, that motivated her even more, right? To say, you know, I will go to Princeton, I will get into Princeton, I will succeed. And I think that's really important in thinking through kind of ideas of this push towards what African Americans can be allowed to do, what they're seen as kind of, having access to and being able to participate in. So this is, when we talk about kind of this perfection complex, I think it's part of what Michelle is trying to really emphasize here is that from a very young age, African Americans are told that their success and their movement forward in society is premised on them being not just perfect, but beyond perfect, right? Twice as good and working twice as hard in order to get just the very basics. So there's this idea there too, that, this is how the world operates. And so I think Michelle's existing within this. And one of the things that we'll see later on, particularly with Michelle's career, but also with her time in the White House, is that this perfection complex is something that persists, right? That they have to be perfect in every single thing that they do, because you can't give people quarter because they will take everything away.
The documentary also talks about the balance of career, family, and relationship for Michelle. While supporting Barack Obama's political career, she had to put aside some of her ambition. Can you speak to that tightrope balance in her life?
Well, what's interesting here is that I think, Michelle Obama makes a decision at a certain point in her career, right? She's the primary breadwinner. She has the more powerful job at the time. She's a high-ranking executive in various factors. She's, worked in startups, and in fact, that has been her thing, and she's quite skilled at it. And there comes a point where they have this conversation about you might have to take a backseat role. And I think what's interesting is that Black women oftentimes don't get the opportunity to take a secondary role in these kind of traditional or nuclear environments. So one of the things that she talks about, particularly in the autobiography, is about how it felt foreign, right? It felt out of place. But at the same time, I think it allowed her a space, at least later on, to talk about taking on a non-traditional role for herself, to be, at her husband's side. And I want to stress that even though she takes essentially a back seat and kind of puts her career on hold, it's not in a way, it doesn't lessen her power anymore, right? It's not, I don't think the way that we think of it as kind of like a housewife role or somebody who's doesn't have power. That in fact, what she does is ends up transforming her power to a different space, into a different environment. Do I think Michelle Obama, falls off because she's no longer in these positions of power? Absolutely not. But it transforms, and she's not doing a public performance of power anymore because she's allowing her husband to take that public position.
I want to talk a little bit about Michelle Obama on the campaign trail. She became kind of the go-to campaigner even early on in 2008. And she really struggled early on when the Obama campaign wasn't working directly with her, about perceptions of her. When she was on the trail speaking on behalf of her husband, she gave that speech in which she said she was finally proud to be an American for the first time. And it got a lot of blowback. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about how race really impacted perceptions of her on the campaign trail. She was often seen by the right as an angry Black woman, and she was asked to kind of reel things in. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, and I think this is such a huge topic. It's one that I think really encompasses her experience in the White House, in American politics more generally, and one that at the very beginning of their political, she and Barack Obama's political career, she's really quite forthright with and quite open with. And it's not until after she leaves the White House that she opens up again about that experience. And I think part of it is that she was really quite at the beginning, very open about what her experience had been like in America as a Black woman, and thought that she could speak to audiences in that way. And keep in mind, she's a phenomenal and inspirational speaker. and thought that she could convey those experiences. So I actually would encourage anyone to go back and listen to some of those talks that she gives in some of those speeches, where she really talks about the rawness and the reality of being a Black woman who has had this really contested relationship, this non-privileged relationship with the United States, and has witnessed kind of the intersection of race and gender and class in the United States, and has noticed that the United States has come up lacking. But one of the other things that we see is very quickly after those moments where she immediately gets attacked for her honesty, for her perspective on what her American experience has been like, and essentially saying that in a lot of ways the state has failed, the American state has failed Black people. That one of the things that happens is that the Obama campaign people bring her in, and we see her undergo this major makeover. And it's not just an aesthetic makeover, although that part is important, but it's also, I think, a rhetorical makeover, at least in terms of how she presents herself, how she talks about the nation. And I want to bring it back to this idea of the perfection complex, because I think that was a lesson about how you have to be in order to win over the majority of white Americans in this country, right? Which are necessary for victory. You can't talk about the dark underpinning of America. You can't talk about inequality in a way that doesn't necessarily coddle white fragility. That, as a Black woman, she can't do anything that would alienate, right, white suburban women from this coalition that, the Democratic Party is trying to build in this moment. So we see a complete reining back. We see a Michelle Obama who is not, as open, who is very, very private now about her participation. And in a lot of ways, I kind of liken it to this, the political boot camp, the aesthetic and rhetorical political boot camp that Black people have to go through in order to be politically viable in this country. They can't be their true selves on a national stage. They have to present a kind of polished, perfect version that is deeply American and in a lot of ways de-raced, and in some ways, de-sexed, at least in terms of gender. So we get another version of Michelle Obama that comes out of this experience, specifically because the United States is not ready to handle a Black woman on center stage in this way. And so I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the reaction to her, particularly later in the presidency, because one of the things that we see is that even after Michelle Obama changes, she does all of these, dramatic makeovers, particularly in the way that she talks and she presents herself, that it's still not enough.
Mhm. And I'm wondering, kind of building on that, the idea when Michelle enters the White House, she says that her role is going to be mom in chief. And she got a little blowback from feminists on the left that they expected more from her. They expected her to kind of go in the footsteps of Eleanor Roosevelt or Hillary Clinton. And I wonder if you can speak to that, how that was received overall.
Certainly. So, I think one of the things that's really important to remember about Michelle Obama when she enters into the White House is that there is no model for what she is about to do. She's the first Black lady, period, right? There is no, I can look to the model of Hillary Clinton, or I can look to the model of, a Nancy Reagan or something like that. She can't do that. And we do see that she reaches out to the living former first ladies and has conversations with all of them about, what are the things that you would take away? What is the things that you would stress? But in addition to kind of coming in this uncharted territory, she also has something different from, she has a Black family that she's bringing in, including 2 little Black girls. And so we do know that the White House is extremely difficult for, first children, particularly young first children. But then when you add the layer of race onto it and then gender, it's, we're talking about something that just, we don't have any basis for understanding at that moment. We know that Black childhood is not valued in America. Right? We know that Black children, particularly Black girls and Black girlhood, is something that should be protected because it has been so unprotected for so long. And so I think one of the things that people missed when she said, I'm going to be mom in chief, is the way in which that operates in 2 different ways. Certainly there's the, my concern is my family and that's what I'm going to do, but that's also a political statement. It is a deeply political, I think, statement in terms of what Black women are allowed to do and what she wanted to protect. The other aspect of that too is, remember, Michelle Obama's mother is moving in with her, and I think that's something that's just unheard of. That's something that we haven't seen before in the White House. So now there's like a first mother-in-law living in the White House and living in that environment. And I think here what really matters again is that when Michelle Obama says, I'm going to be mom in chief, that doesn't dilute any of her past, accomplishments. And it certainly isn't anti-feminist, but it is a statement about priorities and about the protection of her home and family in an era and in a space that has been deeply hostile to women and people like them.
Michelle has said that she has no interest in politics or running for office, but there seems to be a really strong desire for her to run for office. And according to a Gallup poll, she's been named the most admired woman for a third year in a row.
Yeah.
Can you speak to her dislike of politics, and um, how do you think that's contributed to her appeal?
Sure. So I think one thing to put out there is that everybody loves someone until they decide that they're going to run for politics. And
Mhm.
so, just to contextualize it a little bit, Hillary Clinton was extremely popular prior to her 2008 presidential run. And granted, there's this longer history there, certainly, of antagonists and things like that. But also, again, in 2015, in 2015, she was also had pretty high popularity ratings. All of that, I think, changes when you make a declaration about seeing yourself as a political figure and showing your ambition for political spaces, particularly if people believe that you don't belong in those political spaces, or they feel like you're entitled to those political spaces. So I'd be curious, if Michelle, in the event that Michelle Obama ever decided she was going to run for some kind of office, which I don't think she will do, um, I would be curious to see what those numbers look like. And my suspicion, and in my speculation, is that those numbers would look drastically different. They'd still be high, but there would be a contingency that would be adamantly opposed to seeing somebody like her in a position of power, whether it be, at the state level or at the federal level. With that said, I think, Michelle Obama tells a story about how when she's leaving in 2017, the plane ride, the official plane ride over, one last plane ride over, Washington D.C. She just cries, like she bursts into tears and she's crying. And people are like, is she crying because Donald Trump won? Is she crying because, like, oh my gosh, the state of the country? And she's like, no, I'm crying because I am relieved. Like, I'm done. I am out of there. And I think the reality is that, you know, Michelle Obama didn't sign up for this at any point, even back to Barack Obama state senator days. And at each point, she's been a good team player and also has seen the kind of pain and the kind of frustration and the kind of, experience that her family has had to go through, and the kind of political process, the kind of, the rottenness, the very rottenness of the American political process and the unjustness of the American political process. And knowing that she wouldn't be able to be her true self, her full self, right? Her complete self. That even now in the aftermath of no longer being in the White House, right? Like essentially saying, I'm free. There is still a hesitancy on her part in public conversations to reveal her true self. And I think a lot about, so there's this idea that a Black woman historian, Darlene Clark Hine, comes up with about the way that essentially Black women disassociate themselves between their public and their private lives. And I think Michelle Obama is a perfect example of somebody, of a Black woman who encapsulates this idea, who keeps her private self very close. The public never really sees Michelle Obama's true private self, and has a public facing image that is designed to protect herself, her identity, but also her family, right? Her daughters, her mother, her brother, these kinds of things, because it is far too dangerous to present her true self, right? Particularly in this arena of American politics that has been very cruel and very unjust to her. So I think this is in part why we won't see a Michelle Obama, declaring a run for the presidency anytime soon.
Michelle Obama's been really much more forward than her husband has been about addressing race and history. She's talked about the White House being built by slaves. And she's also addressed that her husband had a security detail way earlier than any other presidential candidate ever did. Do you think she was more willing to address those issues of race than her husband was? And how would you compare it to her public statements and serving as First Lady?
So I think since the end of Michelle Obama's tenure in the White House, we've seen her become far more outspoken about race in America and about injustice in America. In fact, in this past week alone, we've seen really forceful statements from the First Lady. I think, in fact, perhaps the most forceful statements that she's made since becoming a public figure in public life. And I think that is in part due to having the freedom of no longer being a political figure or in a political arena, understanding that there are consequences and costs to her, to her family and speaking in that particular way, but also thinking about like her husband's reelection bid, her husband's president of the United States. I'm always struck by the statement that she makes over and over again, where she says, when we got to the White House, we knew that we had to be perfect. There couldn't even be a whiff of a scandal, because we knew that not only would we be judged on that, but every single Black person in America would be judged on that. Any future Black politician coming forward would be judged on that. And so what we see is that in the aftermath of this is aftermath of their tenure in the White House, Michelle feels a bit more freedom to be forceful because they're no longer in the White House. But at the same time, I would say the thing that I notice about those statements, these recent statements, is that even as they're forceful, they are still restrained. And they still, in some respects, conform to the moderation or the moderate nature of the mainstream Democratic Party, right? Like there's nothing that is out of whack, right? There's essentially, tepid support for Black Lives Matter, right? Respectable support for Black Lives Matter. But there's no, we should be out there marching in the streets or something like that. There's no sense of radicalism. And I doubt that there would be, because the cost would be far too great. Now, we also know that Michelle had more freedom to kind of navigate these spaces, both while her husband was president of the United States. She's the First Lady, so there's more room to do this. And we do see her speak out at critical times and at important times. And her voice matters in a way that I think is equally, perhaps this is controversial, but equally important to her husband, Barack Obama. Like it's important that she makes statements in relationship to, say, police killings of Black lives and things like that, or it matters that she makes statements in relationship to, the Newtown shootings or things like that. And there is more freedom there, but it's still within these confines of what is acceptable behavior for a Black woman on a public stage. And what I'm beginning to see is that she is beginning to break from this slightly, but in a way I think that does matter.
So one of the things she also dealt with were a lot of what I would say is microaggressions as First Lady that other First Ladies may not have dealt with. So the shock of her bare arms, fist bump was a big discussion point
Right.
on the news, as well as that putting her arm around the Queen of England. And I'm wondering if you can speak about those negative stereotypes that people kind of attach to her. How did they impact her? Did they impact her?
So, one of the things that she talks about is that the barrage of kind of hate for even the most minor of infractions is overwhelming, that it was constant. And so that, remember that story I told about how when she left, she, just cried tears of exhaustion and in some respects relief, because for 8 years, they had essentially, she and her family, not just, Barack Obama, but she and her family had been under attack. They'd been under assault. one of the things that I do want to point out is that the number of death threats against the president skyrocketed. That there was, the FBI says that, prior to this, in the modern period, there's nothing even quite resembling the kind, the kind of death threats that the first family got, and that's a direct result, not simply of being, this young progressive president, but also because they're Black. They are a Black family. And I think just by their sheer presence and the presence of them in the White House upsets the order that for some people is the natural order of things. So when we think about, the larger history of the United States, right? One of the things that has been constant is that there has been, even in moments of progress, racial progress, there is a constant pushback or backlash in order to reassert what people believe is to be the natural racial hierarchy of the country, right? So there's constant pushback. I think of, I'm just going to use the example of Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? The mass racial massacre that happens there. It happens because Black people step out of place. They're prosperous. And so white residents of the town burn the entire town down. 3,000 Black people go missing, right? Hundreds dead, millions in property damage. And part of what that is an attempt to reassert the racial hierarchy and put Black people in their place, right? Through violent means. And so you have to imagine that being in the White House, there's a constant assault because by their mere presence and their mere existence, being a Black first lady and a Black president with Black children, that they are upsetting the quote unquote natural order or hierarchy of the United States. And so that's in part, why we begin to see not only people kind of reacting in what I would say are totally normal ways, right? So protesting the liberal policies or tyranny of the government in terms of liberalism, but we begin to see the emergence of something that can't be attributed to simply policy differences, right? So for example, when we see the explosion in the Tea Party movement that happens very early on into Barack Obama's term, when you actually sit down and you interview some of these activists, they will say things like, well, I feel like they're un-American. Barack Obama is not of this country. Michelle Obama is, doesn't love this country like I do. So there's this kind of push to make them foreign. And the only thing that is actually foreign about them is their Blackness, right? And in Michelle Obama's case, it's being a Black woman. So I think that these infractions become these, whether it be microaggressions or outright racism, right? We see caricatures of the Obamas, Michelle Obama in particular, where she is drawn as a gorilla. That is a very old racial trope. And we see caricatures of Michelle Obama where she's drawn like a mammy or like a Jezebel. That is about, right, expressing displeasure, right, and delegitimizing her, status as First Lady of the United States. And so I think an important part of this too is that a lot of those efforts that are also included in the delegitimizing, whether it's, throwing a fit because she has bare arms or, suggesting that she's not doing enough as First Lady or what have you, they're also rooted and connected to this idea of Black women and femininity, right? So how are Black women allowed to be feminine or not feminine? And so that, in a sense, is also connected to this idea of humanity, right? And dehumanizing her. So there's a lot of these efforts, whether it's about calling, saying there was a lot of commentary, not just about the bare arms, but about saying, well, she's masculine. Her facial features are masculine. Her arms are masculine. Her body isn't soft and feminine, are also about dehumanizing her while they are also about delegitimizing her.
I want to pivot to her agenda as First Lady. Can you talk about some of her signature issues, things that she chose to do as First Lady, and how her background and how her identity really impacted those choices?
Well, one of the things that always struck me about the Obamas is that there's this, almost hysterical fear when they come into the White House that they're going to be raging radical socialist, Black power, people. And none of that happens. They have a really, really just kind of almost boring presidency. And I say boring because there's no scandal. There's no, the thing that moves the most waves is really, the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. but there's nothing to the extent of like dramatic transformation of society beyond kind of the healthcare portion, right? Like that is the most progressive, I think, that it gets. Um, so when I say that to say that the Obamas are firmly within kind of middle class respectability politics that in a lot of ways has a long tradition within Black communities. So there's this overarching belief that respectability will actually earn African Americans their privileges or their rights or their equality to full citizenship. And we see that even though it's a flawed outlook, right, that it doesn't matter how much money you have or how respectable you are within your community, that in fact, humanity premised on respectability doesn't actually work. I think what's important to stress here is that the Obamas believed in this idea, and this is where perfection comes in this idea of we have to be perfect, we have to be better than, we have to be twice as good. But what we also see too is this emphasis really on, I think, a combination of bootstrapping your way to uplift, right? And this actually comes out, I think, in a lot of the policies and the programs that the Obamas fund, but also that it is possible to, focus on the most vulnerable in society and try and kind of do this infusion of government help, but also self-help. And so we see that Michelle Obama says, I'm not going to take the approach of, like Hillary care or something like that. And I think that's not so much because she's disinterested. She's clearly very interested in this, but instead it's about that public-private dynamic, right? She's behind the scenes actually helping out. And she talks a lot about this, right? They would say, okay, Michelle Obama, your office is right here. And she would walk right in. She would walk right into, the Oval Office and be like, I think this is what we should do. Or they'd say, Michelle, we need you to come in to give this information. So it's not like she's not actually helping out. She's actually incredibly important to this effort. But she also says, I decided that if we're going to try and drop healthcare rates, I'm going to take a proactive approach and essentially a self-help approach. So this is where we see the Let's Move campaign, the focus on, gardening, getting fit, good vegetables, good choices, right? Like having Beyonce do an ad campaign about fitness and health in underprivileged schools and marginalization. And I think what this is a reflection of both this idea that Michelle comes in with from her upbringing, but also a reflection of this larger kind of Black middle class, like working class and middle class aspects of respectability and how to achieve change, right? Change comes through this mix of public private, whether it be federal public partnership and self-help. And we see this play out very much so in the Let's Move campaign. But again, before we move on to the next question, I want to emphasize that we have to read this on multiple levels, because it's not suggesting that Michelle Obama is not, active or involved or powerful in this arena, but that instead, what she allows us to view is very selective. So the power that she allows us to see is very selective, and she makes that decision out of concern for the perception, the outward perception, and the outward attacks that this Black family is getting while in the White House.
I want to talk a little bit about her legacy, but first, in 2018, the National Portrait Gallery unveils Amy Sherald's portrait of Michelle Obama. And this quote Amy Sherald says at the unveiling, "Women can relate to Michelle, no matter what shape, size, race, or color. We see our best selves in her." I wonder if you can comment on that relatability factor. So on one side, she's the first Black woman to take on this role, and it's new, and she's someone different, and in the other end, she's someone anyone can relate to, no matter what their background, race, identity, size. Can you talk a little bit about that push-pull?
Sure. And so, one quick plug, which is that if you haven't seen Michelle Obama's portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, I highly encourage you to see it, because it's striking in person, and there are very subtle details that I think are incredibly important. So, for example, like her nail polish in the portrait is lavender. And so lavender is, largely it can be associated with the Black womanist movement, in the Black feminist movement as well, right? Like Alice Walker writes in Search of Our Daughters, and In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. So there's this So I think there's certainly a connection there between Black feminist and Black womanist politics, and as this massive portrait that's done of her, the choosing of the artist in order to make this, and how she portrays her. But then the other part of this too, that I want to stress, just before jumping into this idea, is the concept of likability and how it applies to women. And there's been so much literature written about likability and women candidates, but also Black women candidates. And so likability is something that male candidates just don't have to deal with. Right? We don't ask the same things around men that we ask of women. And I think Michelle Obama, but also the people surrounding Michelle Obama, understood that in order for the Obamas to be successful and to make it out of the White House, essentially in one piece, that likability, particularly when it came to Michelle Obama, and relatability was going to be key to that. And so this is something that starts way before, we get to this moment of the unveiling of the portrait. This is something that really starts on the campaign trail after that huge, that hyperbolic backlash to Michelle Obama, this understanding that, wait, she's central to whatever political aspirations Barack Obama has. So there has to be some kind of transformation, whether it be aesthetic or, like actual literal transformation. So they spent a lot of time cultivating a likable personality. Now, it's not hard to do because Michelle Obama is Michelle Obama, and she's, people who talk about her from childhood to present, so she's like an easy woman to like and an easy woman to relate to. But they emphasize that, they pull that out. And I think part of this too is that when we see Black politicos, when we see Black politicians, Black statesmen, when we see Black prominent figures with enormous amounts of success, like Oprah Winfrey, for example, that the key to their success is likability and relatability, particularly as it relates to white women. So the ability for white women to project onto this figure, this Black woman figure, their aspirations, their dreams, their ambitions is key. And so we see a lot of Michelle Obama really navigating this. And so this is what we again mean about how not having the ability to show, her true self to the American public, that they are very selective about what they allow forward. The one area where I would say that they're actually quite radical and revolutionary in some ways is that they allow Michelle Obama to be deeply feminine and to be a mother in a space where Black women are often told that they cannot be feminine, that they cannot be motherly, that they can't take on traditional roles, right? That they can't be a housewife, even though we know that Michelle Obama is not a housewife, but that she can't simply just be a mother, that she is allowed to do those things. And by virtue of doing that, but also navigating this really tightrope of how she presents herself, right, and softening herself, and really how she presents the political ambitions or how powerful she is, whether she draws back and then presenting this image to the American public, that to me is actually quite radical in that space during this period of time.
Well, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. And as we're encouraging people to put questions into the Q&A or pass them over to us on Facebook, I just want to clarify that I overlooked that Dr. Leah Wright Rigueur is the Harry Truman Professor of American History at Brandeis University. So I apologize for that. And as we're speaking about your role as a historian and your research, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your current research, and I'm especially interested in the reception of the Obamas by African American Republicans. If you can expand on that while talking about some of your research and books you've published.
Sure. So, I'm actually working on a new project, which actually two new projects. One is about the kind of race riot and backlash of modern America. So looking at, racial massacres, race riots, urban rebellion, and backlash movements really starting in the early 20th century, rooted around race and bringing it all the way up to the present, including, last week's riots that we see. The second book that I'm working on is looking at Black men and women and how they operate in the White House during the 1980s and into the 1990s, and the kind of worlds that they have to navigate, particularly around this idea of survival. And so for some people, survival looks radically different than what we would imagine. So really teasing out what it means to be Black in a space that was never intended for you. And so what are some of the consequences, right? So what are some of the, really remarkable things that people are able to achieve, right, in pursuit of survival? But then also, what are the really, disastrous decision making that happens because people are operating out of, fear and survival in political moments? And I'm particularly interested in this idea of corruption, because one of the things that we see from Black men and women in these spaces, whether they be Republican, whether they be Democratic-led administrations, is that corruption is often an end result of having to operate in spaces that are explicitly hostile to you and your existence. But what is remarkable about, I think, the Obama administration is that we don't see corruption. We just don't see it. And in fact, that is, I think part of what the Obamas really understand, but in particular Michelle Obama, is that in navigating this tightrope, that they have to avoid corruption, and that means being squeaky clean. That means that perfection, right, attitude, because anything that they do will be used against them later on down the line. And so I've been really tracing this idea that stems back much longer back through Black politicos who work within predominantly white administrations.
An audience.
And I think, I think you also asked about, and I'm happy to answer now or later after an audience member question, but I'm happy to talk about how Republicans react, Black Republicans react to the Obama.
Can you go ahead and expand on that, please?
Sure. So, in one of the things that we see in the lead up to the Obama administration is that there's an interesting fact about Black Republicans, which is amongst all racial groups within the Republican Party, Black Republicans are the most likely to defect over to either an independent third party candidate or the Democratic Party, right? So they say, I am a Republican, but I'm going to vote for the Democratic candidate. And this is something that precedes Barack Obama by leaps and bounds. The reason for this, and Black Republicans say this off the record all the time, but also in some respects on the record with regard to surveys and polling, is that they feel like more than 55% of them feel like the Republican Party doesn't have their best interests in mind or their needs in mind. And they're explicitly talking about the racial elements of the Republican Party. That is a shocking number. So more than half of the Black people that affiliate with your party believe that you actually don't have the best interest of Black people in mind with your policies, with your programs, with your rhetoric, with your attitudes. And so you have to consider this as we are moving into the Obama administration. Now, for a second, it appeared like there could be the potential for a Black Republican to be, on the presidential stage, two different points in time. The first is with Edward Brooke in the 1960s, where there's kind of this large conversation behind the scenes. And essentially Republican elites decide the nation is not ready for a Black president, even though Black people say, yes, the nation is ready. Later on, Colin Powell takes on that role. And we know that he has enormous popularity amongst all racial groups. And so he's asked and he declines. And I think we have to think about why he would decline. One of the reasons he declines is for the very same reasons that Michelle Obama talks about, why she would decline to run for president, which is that the intensity and kind of the assault that you would receive being a public Black figure in that kind of position of power, for a lot of people just isn't worthwhile. So we see that drops off. So when Barack Obama emerges on the scene and he becomes a serious contender, I think Black Republicans, the majority of Black Republicans say, I don't want to be on the wrong side of history. And so they vote for Barack Obama. A lot of that disappears during his second term in office, but it does a number on Black Republican support for the Republican Party, because, who wants to be the Black person that's not supporting the first Black president of the United States. And so we do see a lot of that. And I think it's encapsulated when somebody like Colin Powell in 2008, again in 2012, says, I consider myself to be a Republican. I'm extremely, popular amongst the Republican base and amongst the Democratic base and amongst, people of all races. And I will be voting for Barack Obama.
Thank you so much for expanding upon that. And I want to close it out with one audience question because we are almost out of time. Laura Bush continued to use the Bush Presidential Library to make change through literacy programming, sharing the history of First Ladies. Can or should or will Michelle do the same in Chicago with the Obama Center? So how do you see that museum library space taking a role in the history of presidential libraries and the Obama legacy?
So, as someone who has spent a lot of time and a lot of years combing through the archives of almost all of the modern presidential libraries, and when I say a lot of time, I mean years, but also going to the museums, right, and really enjoying that aspect of it, and in some cases, even participating in some of the programs, the literacy, whether it be literacy programs, whether it be educational programs, saying that it is crucial that the Obamas, but particularly Michelle Obama, incorporate that into their post-presidency career. And so, in some respects, we're beginning to see that. And we've seen that Michelle Obama, particularly through the launch of her book, has combined that with outreach programs, right? Like if anybody has seen the Netflix documentary, but also if anybody participated in the tour, there were a series of events that were surrounding, each tour stop designed to advance the goals, some of the goals that the former First Lady continues to push. We also saw that with the announcement of the Obama, Presidential Library and Museum, that they were going to try and do something that was different than than any presidential library had done before, which is that they're also trying to make it into a community space. And so they talk about how there will be, kind of a sports area, there'll be a recording studio, there'll be other aspects of the library that traditionally modern presidential libraries since, Franklin Roosevelt just haven't done. And I think that is actually important, but it's also important because it's what the people of Chicago demanded. So essentially after, they got the bid, the people of Chicago were like, if you're going to be here, this also has to be a space, right? You have to replace that what you're removing. So it can't simply just be a library and museum. The last part though, that I think to me opens up a lot of questions moving forward into the future is that the Obama administration, let me back up a second. Presidential libraries and museums moving into the future have a digitization problem on their hands. They have to digitize to move into the modern period, right? So digital documents. Also, the number of documents, particularly in the technological advancement age, has increased dramatically. And I think that is also connected to these ideas of programs and policies. The thing is that, the federal government only has limited budget and manpower to be able to do those kinds of things. So the Obamas actually stepped in and, have said, we will pay for the cost of the digitization of part of this. And I think it opens a lot of questions about ownership, about transparency, about the future of kind of digital archives and how important that is for scholars, but also for people who want to keep record of what happened during those years and afterwards. So I think that combined with the continuation of programs that we saw under the administration is really important and certainly is still there. And then the last thing that I will say is that the Obama Foundation has absolutely continued the programs that we saw under the Obama administration, and in fact has expanded them in a lot of ways, like through Obama Fellows and the Obama Education Fellows, which take place in 2 cities across the country, including Chicago, usually Chicago, every year. So I think we're seeing that, and that we can expect that there'll be much more to come.
Well, Dr. Leah Wright Rigueur, thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion of Michelle Obama and her legacy. Really appreciate all the really interesting commentary you provided with us. If you are just tuning in late, please be sure to connect with the National First Ladies Library on YouTube or social media to see the entirety of this program. So thank you so much, Dr. Rigueur, and thank you all for tuning in today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.